HR nerds, this is Nicole Dessain. Welcome to Talent Tales, the show where I interview leaders who have brought design thinking to their talent and HR practices. In today's episode, we have a special guest on the show. I'm joined by Jayne Glick, who is the Director Organizational Effectiveness at IA Collaborative. See, already in the intro, I'm blurbing. Welcome, Jayne.
Good to be here. I'm so excited to talk to you today, Nicole.
Yay. So let's dive right in. Who are you and what's your story?
Okay, so my story is wandering. When I was an undergrad studying visual design communications, one of my favorite professors told me to follow my nose, where I'm most curious, and that's been my mantra throughout my career. Yep, exactly. Like, what's the most interesting thing? So I went from visual communication design to advertising to project management to now org effectiveness, and specifically focusing on talent and talent development. And the golden thread of this has been, making people's lives better, and then specifically making, my coworkers' lives better. So it could manifest from like processes, tools, but it's what I get most excited about and rewarded by. So
Yeah,
a
I
little bit.
love that. Just have like a guiding principle, it sounds like,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
sort of direct your career along that principle, it sounds like, or those values.
It's easier upon reflection, and thinking
Yeah.
about what that is and sort of
Yeah.
synthesizing it, what has been the thing. And then, it's nice to take a pause and then be like, is that what I want to do in the future? And then that
Mhm.
kind of can give you a guiding path and a principle for the future. Yeah.
Yeah. So cool. And just a little background for the listeners. We crossed paths at Northwestern's Masters in Learning and
Yes.
Organizational Change program, um, which is a great community. And so that's
Awesome.
when your nose followed you there. I guess that's when we connected.
It did. It was a long time in the making. I spent about 2 years deciding if I wanted to go to grad school and which one, and went to a lot of info sessions year over year, and then finally decided to bite the bullet and do it. I think the
Yeah.
pandemic really, like for a lot of us, it really did cause some of the self-reflection and what do I want out of my career, and what do I want to do next. And MSLOC and Northwestern has been a really awesome experience to do that part-time.
Hmm. Yay. All right. So the question everybody is always waiting for is, what's your superpower?
I know. When I saw this question, I was like, "Ugh, I feel so like self-conscious talking about my superpowers."
Oh.
Um, but is this where should I show my post-it?
Yes, you should show
Okay.
your visual aid. Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Let's see
Okay.
here. Sorry.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
what it
yeah.
means essentially is I feel like I'm really good at taking a lot of inputs, or when conversations are happening and we're brainstorming ideas or trying to understand a problem. I love to document and try to organize and structure and synthesize in real time, um, using a lot of like visual aids, maybe just note taking, depending on what it is, to make things simpler. And like, is this what we're talking about? And I think I find a lot of joy in doing that, and it feels like it makes the conversation really effective, and people can respond to their ideas in real
Mhm.
time and move things around. And so I love, like design thinking, methods include a lot of post-it notes. So whether that's virtual or in person, digital or in person, being able to, create something for folks to respond to.
It's such an important skill, especially in these times of complexity,
Yeah.
to be able to synthesize a lot of information and data and
Mm-hmm.
have it sort of in a format that people can digest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Superpower, don't be self-conscious about it. That's, we talk about, what makes us uniquely human in times of AI. I guess,
Mm-hmm.
technically it can do that,
Yeah.
right? But I always feel like there's something lost. There's some creative thought because you can synthesize
Mm-hmm.
and you can synthesize, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like human synthesis still brings something else to the table, a little bit
Yeah.
more connection making, I think, and creativity than what AI is currently capable of. So
Yeah, depending on what you're trying to do, it's really good at like
Yeah.
topical categorization. But then if you're
Hmm.
thinking about, the context of things and user needs within the context of a situation,
Yes.
it's hard for them to really grasp that in a
Hmm.
conversation. Like
Hmm.
one of the methodologies in design thinking is observation.
Hmm.
And maybe in the future, AI could use video and observe things within
Hmm.
the context of the video, but right now that's what we do really well.
Yeah.
What are people doing versus saying, and that could be a really powerful way to
Yeah.
understand users
I love
and our
that.
teams within HR.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. Love
yeah,
that. So you already spoke about design thinking. That's why we're here. So tell us a little
yeah.
bit why and how you got started with using design thinking in an HR context, specifically inside your organization.
Yeah,
And if you
so
have a few examples that you want to share, I know you have a
yeah.
couple. We can dive into those as well.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. So I grew up, quote unquote, professionally learning about design thinking even in undergrad and kind of came to the people side of things
Hmm.
second. So it might be flipped for most people.
Yeah.
And I work at a design consultancy where we do use design thinking methodologies, user-centered methodologies within our work. And I've been a practitioner of that with clients. And internally now, so I worked on the client side for a few years, and then moved internally to work on org effectiveness and talent initiatives for the team. And we have currently worked on revamping our career framework. And that means a lot of things. So career framework, performance process, the tools that we use. So it's very like complex program with a lot of different tracks of work and a lot of dependencies across that. And, throughout that work, we really wanted to make sure that we were thinking about our team at the center of that and what their, current state of mind, current experience, desires for the future might be. And so we used a lot of co-creation with our team. So when we kicked off this career framework, we had an existing career framework, and it was working well, but it felt like there were just we had evolved as a company, and there were some things that we were considering incorporating, but we wanted the input of our team. So we facilitated co-creation sessions with individual contributors, with managers, and then with the executive team, all separately, so we could have some psychological safety within those environments,
Hmm.
and had them sticky note prioritize which aspects of potential consideration should we prioritize. So how important is it to you to include our maxims, which is our values? How do you think about like the leveling, the roles that we've added outside of our career framework, like project lead, company growth lead? Is that important to you to have as like benchmarks for your growth? So we collected all of that input and came with a prioritization of like, okay, maybe we consider our maxims and our values, but we don't need to create the framework around them because that doesn't seem to be a super high priority for the team.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to then make some decisions that we felt reflected the needs and desires of our team. And about a year later, rolled it out. So it's been a labor of love, but a really fun process.
That's so cool. Did you then also, so it sounds like in the sort of ideation stage, you co-created with the employees. What did you do in the discovery phase and then prototype? How did you prototype it? Kind of.
Yeah. So in terms of the ideation, I think one part of the process where we did ideate, and maybe we didn't involve everybody just because
Hmm.
it some of the aspects of like thinking about the performance review process was another track of work. So we have our
Hmm.
career framework and then our performance review process, and we used service blueprint to help us identify the touch points. So thinking about and ideating around what are those touch points? What do we want our managers to have from a feedback growth areas perspective at what points? And use that as a way to brainstorm some of the concepts that, and even some of the considerations around performance management, like what are the incentives that we are considering and not considering, and using that as a tool for ideating.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like evaluating, we I'm trying to remember what it was called. We did oh shoot, what did we call it? Pressure testing, basically,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
studies. So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because you know, ideally when you're able to involve the user at all stages, like it's I love doing that, but for some of these things, like if we're re-leveling, there's going to be some maybe nervousness or anxiety, and some of the change management things we couldn't roll out very like explicitly. Um, or we had to kind of like unveil it, for lack of a better term,
Mm-hmm.
versus what I like to do is you know, open a piece of information, get feedback, evolve. But sometimes
Yeah.
it's hard to do that when you're doing some HR projects. So it's just to acknowledge that some of those processes might look different. Um, but we did what we called pressure testing, which was having some of the career managers who were semi-aware of what was happening, maybe not part of the core team, but the extended team, look through the framework that was done and think about their direct reports. And do they is this accurately describing what they do at their level? What's missing? What could be updated? What behaviors are missing? Or ranges of activities, like 6 to 8 reps of something. And that gave us a really good understanding of some of the little tweaks we could make. And then some of the terminology even came up. So
Mm-hmm.
we ended up renaming some things because of just considerations from our career managers. So
Mm-hmm.
leveraging our manager team was really helpful in context for that. And then we also prototyped our tool. So Lattice is the tool that we use for our performance management process, and that was another track of work where we found the right tool for us, and got onboarded to the tool. That's where our career framework lives. We have performance reviews in there, feedback, and one-on-one. So it all lives within that spot. And that was one where change management wise, we could roll that out one feature at a time. So starting with
Mm-hmm.
one-on-ones to get people comfortable with using the tool, getting feedback, iterating, um, uh, using the feedback tool and having a training for that, making sure people were comfortable with using the tool. And now we're doing performance reviews. And now we've been able to collect all of this like one-on-one feedback information to make it useful for the performance reviews. So instead of like waiting and making sure we had everything all at once, we rolled out like feature by feature. And that was actually really helpful for change management and just knowing how the tool works, how people use the tool, and kind of evolving with them as we got feedback.
I really like this example and how you showcase how the complexity of applying design thinking in an HR context, because it's
Mm-hmm.
a little bit different than I think product design, or a lot different than product design, quite frankly, and a little bit different than service design.
Mm-hmm.
Because so, and especially, so you mentioned career frameworks, performance management. Those are some of those processes you screw in one little, screw there, everything else is impacted, right? Because
Yeah.
they're all so interconnected. So I think it's really important for HR folks to recognize as you get started or more mature in your design thinking practice that you have to balance sort of systems thinking. That's why I love to sort of complement design thinking in HR with
Mm-hmm.
systems thinking, to look
Mm-hmm.
at the bigger picture and the implications of the system while not losing sight of the individual human. And then how do you weave these two approaches together
Mm-hmm.
so you can roll it out in a meaningful way to the organization, right? Because
Yeah.
design thinking, and you said, would be incremental, small changes, which is very unfamiliar to HR because we always want to tie things up in a bow and do like a big bang. Maybe we pilot,
Mm-hmm.
but right. So that's very counter to design thinking. But sometimes we do need to integrate it into a bigger systems sort of approach. So I kind of love
Yeah.
how you guys handled that with, some things we just have to do it that maybe big bang way, but other things, which are the other small incremental changes we can make and test and iterate along the way. So sort of have a two-prong approach. And I think that
Hmm.
can feel sometimes really messy to
Hmm.
HR and to everybody involved. So I
Yeah.
think there is change management required there as well. And I'm just curious because I assume, you mentioned that in your organization, probably everybody has some sort of a design background or knows design thinking. So do you think that it was easier to have that kind of an audience to conduct design thinking on an internal
Hmm.
process? And then also the maybe willingness to go along with it, and then also with the rollout. I'm just curious how having that kind of an audience that seems primed for this kind of an approach reacted to it.
Yes, I mean, when we do any sort of thing, I think everyone expects to participate in some way. I don't think everybody expects to have like decision-making power, but they want to contribute because they have like opinions and experiences that are valuable to, what we're trying to accomplish. And I think there's a lot of desire to contribute to that. So it's almost like maybe the opposite of what most organizations have, where you're like, please, I want to talk to you. And they're like, why is this important? It's almost like thinking about for our team, like, what is the most effective use of your time? How can I,
Hmm.
make sure I'm not taking too much time away from what you have to do for your client work, for your team. Um, but I want to, pick your brain on X thing. And maybe it's a little bit more focused and like strategic as we move along. Like, for example, I am working on a performance management like um, review process orientation because we've revamped, like I said, our performance review process. We've added different questions. We want to talk a little bit about why that's important, why we're doing upward reviews, why we're asking these questions. And I set up time tomorrow with some of the managers that are core to the uh, have been involved with the career framework work in the past to just make sure that like it, I want to understand upward feedback. What are questions or concerns your team might have based on this?
Mm-hmm.
Or, for managers, we're asking these questions in addition to the ones you're expecting. Do you see any risks or things we should get ahead of before we have the training? So we're not
Mm-hmm.
caught flat-footed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just
Mm-hmm.
constantly getting that feedback in, strategic ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So it seems like keeping sort of an open feedback loop throughout
Yeah.
everything has been
Yeah.
successful with that audience. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Mhm.
What are and maybe you would consider this a barrier that we just discussed, I don't know, but people always want to know like candidly about barriers. So what were the barriers that you encountered in bringing design thinking into your organization and how did you overcome them?
Um, I I think that I think what I mentioned before, it's sort of like what types of processes do you need to use at what point in time?
Mm,
And being really intentional about, where am I at in the process and what am I looking for, um, you know, for that work? Because, design thinking is very nonlinear and you
mm-hmm,
can kind of be in different phases at different times and go backwards and then jump ahead. And so, figuring out what tools work at the right times could be really helpful to make sure there's no like pushback from people because they don't understand why. And I think being very clear about maybe you're using design thinking methodologies in a nonlinear way, but there's a different plan that you can communicate. Like, we're here and this is why we need you. And this is, what we're hoping to achieve with your time. And just making sure they understand like where they're contributing to the broader picture, might be helpful. And then, if you're trying to engage stakeholders, for example, who are maybe a little bit skeptical about design thinking. I think Teresa Torres, who is part of the DOEC program, Designing for Organizational Effectiveness, that we're a part of at Northwestern. She teaches that course and mentions a lot about engaging stakeholders consistently and showing
mm-hmm,
the value quickly. Because I think that and this happens with our clients too. Like we want to make sure we're like proving the value of the process, and what we're learning and what we're doing next, on a weekly or biweekly basis versus a quarterly basis, because, that is also a chance to get to self-correct and get feedback and input for the process
Mm-hmm.
itself. So I think those are some of the things that I've learned along the way, working with clients, working with our team, related to design thinking processes.
Yeah, you already mentioned the word value. That ties into my
Mhm.
next question, which is
Okay.
impact.
Mhm.
Folks are always curious about that, if you can share that. So I don't know if you have any sort of impacts that you've seen from the new career framework already,
Mm.
or any other internal work where you've used design thinking. What kind of tangible or intangible impact have you seen?
So I think including people in the process and having them contribute really helps with the change management process. So it might feel like it takes longer upfront, where you're involving more people. It might take more time to schedule things and get feedback. But knowing that they're aware of the project, being bought into the work that you're doing, is only going to help when you have to roll it out. And they could say, I participated in this and I believe in this. And that can really alleviate a lot of the potential change management issues later in the line. So I think, that is definitely one impact that I've seen, and we've seen from a client side for our client projects, and then also internally with our team. So again, like the career framework and performance review process, we did try to bring folks in at specific moments, and I think even just providing updates on where we were at and being open about, if we're changing schedules or things, just being very transparent about that, has helped folks understand that, their information, their opinions and prioritization was taken into consideration. And I think we tried to answer that along the way. And then especially when we unveiled it at the end, making sure that we answered, how we started with those initial kickoff co-creation sessions.
Mhm. I love your point about bringing people along. I sometimes say
Mhm.
design thinking is change management 2.0 for
Yeah,
that
I love
reason,
that.
right?
Yeah.
Because if you, guess what? If you co-create something with people,
Mhm.
they're more willing to adopt it versus you
Mhm.
design something and then shove it down people's throats, you know?
Right.
I think that's all. Sometimes in HR traditionally, we have been working a little bit like that,
Mhm.
and people are just not having it anymore. They're demanding more and more to be treated like adults, right? Rightfully so, right?
Yeah.
And as an adult, you don't want to be told what to do. You want to
Yeah.
have um you want to have skin in the game. You want to have agency, I think, is the term
Mhm.
that Dan Pink's coined in his book Drive back then. People
Mhm.
want to have agency, people want to be part of something. And also I think, especially in times that we're in now with, continuous change
Yeah.
all the time, inside and outside the workplace. People are so burned
Mhm.
out because everything is like change everywhere, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
and how do you gain some semblance or feel some semblance of control even in
Mhm.
your environment anymore? It's when you can be part of shaping it, I think. So
Yeah.
um so it's interesting that you've also seen that as an impact in your work internally and externally.
Yeah, and it is such a tension of, like how to involve people when in a way that feels, especially for HR, it could be there are some things where maybe you can't involve
Hmm.
everybody you need to involve
Yep.
because of it's the sensitivity,
Yep. Hmm.
of what you're talking about. But one
Yep.
term that's sort of semi-related but not quite the same, is one of my favorite grad school terms, procedural justice.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
if you create processes and structures for team members to um, contribute to a decision, whether they're the decision maker or not, whether their decision is chosen or not as the ultimate outcome, if it feels fair and unbiased as a decision-making process, people are more likely to believe in that decision. And I think that it speaks a lot to like, how do you have transparent leadership? And I think, design thinking is a really great way to practice some of those things in a sort of day-to-day project or initiative focused way.
I love that. So what's your favorite design thinking resource or hack?
Okay. I love a good prototype. I mean, I come from a design background, so making
Mhm,
is, I like to, make things and get a reaction to them. So it could be a digital tool, it could be like a process, like we talked about the performance review process. Um, you know, uh, it's sort of like I know that design thinking sort of for in the world of knowledge management, some of that's like working out loud to kind of show your
mhm,
thinking, and I like to kind of call that like micro prototyping. Like
I love that.
you're
Hmm.
constantly like iterating a little bit. But yeah, I think a prototype could be so many things, and it doesn't even have to be called a prototype to be a prototype. It could be
Hmm.
called other things.
Hmm.
Um,
Can you give
so
an example? Because I know this is always really hard for HR to wrap their heads
okay.
around how to how I maybe understand how you would prototype like a physical thing, maybe even
Hmm.
an app, right?
Hmm.
But what how would you prototype more of a process or something more intangible, like a program or like
Yeah.
do you have any kind of cool examples maybe that you've done that could be inspiring for HR?
I don't have like a specific, I can't think off the top of my head of a specific example, but I think you could, visualizing the process is step one to the
Mm-hmm.
prototype, and who's involved with what things, who's in charge of what things, and then saying, hey, let's try this out. So it could be like, we're going to try out this,
So like a
uh,
service blueprint could be
yeah, exactly. A
prototype, right?
service
Mm-hmm.
blueprint could be a prototype. And
Mm-hmm.
then you could use that for like, I don't know, like the promotion process and say, we're going to prototype this for 6 months. I think the other really important thing about prototypes, especially for processes when they're a little bit more complex, is understanding like what the desired outcome is of that prototype, and like what are you measuring to understand if that outcome is correct. So you could get into, either maybe it could be like very, basic, or it could be like we're going to use actual data from our blah 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 tool. But kind of setting some metrics, I think, is another important part of understanding if it's good. And then also using like reflection and
Mm-hmm.
sort of like a post-mortem to
Mm.
decide what do we need to change, what do we need to evolve with, with the team. But I think, a process is kind of fun to test out if it feels clear to people. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we found that, I mean, at IA, if we're like, this is a prototype process, that just ends up being what it is.
Mm.
It just kind of turns
The
into
prototype process becomes the process.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Means it
And maybe it
works, right?
evolves
I mean,
subtly
so
over time. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, why not? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Right. And I think it also is like, if you call it, if you use language in a way where it feels malleable in some type of way, I think people feel like they can give feedback more than if it's like this formal new shiny thing.
Mm-hmm.
So whether your intent is actually to involve, I would say maybe not, maybe not. I would say if you're like, we're going to prototype this and we're going to see how it works and we're going to evolve it as we go. That's usually how we approach things, because we want to make it now. We want to try something out, and knowing that we can always pause and say, this is not working. We have to figure out a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and being okay with that, but also knowing that if it's working, like we're not going to overthink it, and we're going to
Mm-hmm.
continuously tweak and evolve. So I think it's a little bit helps with the barrier of entry to feeling like people can't provide feedback if
Hmm.
it feels too formal.
I love that.
Mhm.
So, in summary, what tips
Yeah.
do you have for those who want to get started with using design thinking in the field of HR?
Well, I think we all have gotten into this talent world because we love people and we care about people. So I think it's a very easy tie to the design thinking framework. Um, and getting them involved in the process. So just try something. It could be a very small thing. It doesn't have to be a whole, we're going to implement design thinking program. It could
Mm-hmm.
literally be, we want to prototype this process. And like, I wrote something on here, like, can you
Mm-hmm.
respond to this?
Mm-hmm.
Should we share this with other people and get their input? Do we need to do immersions with our IC team to see, what they're experiencing day to day, or our managers, because I know that is currently like manager burnout and support
Mm-hmm.
is a hot topic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how do we understand what's happening there? And I think there's a lot of methods and tools throughout the process where you could try something, and not necessarily feel like you have to commit to it all the time.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Just, use little pieces of it instead of the big
Yeah.
end-to-end process. And to your point
Mhm.
earlier, and maybe don't even call it even design thinking,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
sometimes talk about Trojan horsing things in, right? Or packaging them in a different way.
Yep.
Um, you can be really pragmatic about it. That's why I find that term co-creation resonates really more with HR than
Hmm.
design thinking often,
Hmm. Yeah.
um, because of that. It
Yeah.
sounds less designerly, I guess, which can feel scary and intimidating maybe sometimes to
Yeah.
non-designers like us.
Everyone can be a designer.
I
Just
know,
different
but
types.
you can also feel intimidated by something that you're
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
didn't get trained in it, right? So, and as an
Yeah.
adult, we have all these expectations of us and that we've been taught. So this is
Yeah.
really helpful. So the last thing I always do, my favorite
Okay.
part,
Uh-oh.
I always throw a quote at you and let
Okay.
you react. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Quote. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being
Mm.
willing is not enough. We must do. Unquote. Leonardo da Vinci.
Mm. And he made a lot of things. Um, I love that. I don't know if I've heard that before. Um, I guess my response would be yes, just do something, just try something. I think reflection is so important. And planning as a program manager, planning is so important. Um, but I think that at some point you just have to start and then go with it and improv along the way if you have to. And you can always, most of the time, and involve, co-create and evolve what you need to evolve.
Yeah. Well, wise words to close us out. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks, everybody.
Wonderful.
See you at a future Talent Tales.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.